autonomous weapons, but second of all, how we minimize human casualties within this, right? Tell you that opposition must defend the ugly human morals that set, the precedents that include things like war crimes and things like torture. At the end of the day, those are things that we're not willing to support, right? So what does our mechanism look like, man? It's pretty simple. I would tell you the mechanism looks like, first of all, we support things like the creation of autonomous weapons, i.e. things like, autonomous drones, autonomous tanks, etc. But second of all, we also, support the rise of things like, cyber warfare, right? Because we think that these forms of war are alternatives to normal warfare that do not hurt human life directly and do not, impede in what war originally means, right? We think that by that, what we mean is that we're able to achieve the original intent, i.e., garnering more political power or more, resources, right? But saying, well, we think as a result of this first, clarification in our mechanism is that we also, support removing human contact, right? We think that in the future, right, when we implement, all autonomous weapons, we also wish for, people, when the army recruits people, to not recruit people into direct human combat. Rather, it looks like, we're recruiting people into becoming, programmers for drones or, becoming, hackers in regards to cyber warfare, right? So with that said, 2 points from proposition side, right? So first of all, how we maximize the political agenda of war, and second of all, how we reduce the moral ambiguity that often arises when humans have to make decisions, right? So first of all, how do we maximize the political agenda of war? So why do we, first of all, right? Why do we do war in the first place, right? Why do countries go to war, right? I tell you the point of going to war in almost all cases is to further a political agenda, right? Whether that's to impose political ideologies somewhere, or whether that's to get resources or to get capital from another country. We tell you that war is almost always fought for a political reason rather than a objective reason of killing another group of people, right? An example of this would be for example, the US went to Vietnam and engaged in the Vietnam War not to kill Vietnamese people, but rather to impose capitalism in a country with communist beliefs, right? Yeah, as a result of this, war is not necessarily solely based on the murder of human lives, right? So then why is death obstructive, and why do we minimize that through autonomous warfare, right? So then first of all, we minimize casualties within war because we're declining the amount of human combat within war. Let's say, right, humans are not going to be shooting each other on the battlefield. Humans are not going to be shooting missiles torpedoes at each other. They're not going to be hurt to the degree that they are in the status quo. But second of all, we tell you that death hinders moral ambiguity, right? Because we tell you that almost all cases where humans are hurting other people's life directly, right? When you're shooting the enemy, when you need to fire tanks against your enemy, you're always going to make a decision there, right? Then this is where the problem arises, right? Because we see that death hinders moral ambiguity, right? And this is where the comparative comes in. Because on our side, where you get more efficiency within war, why is this the case? Because we tell you that war can be met more easily, right? The point of war is not to eradicate the entire enemy, it's to force them into a compromise so that they can agree to whatever you may do, right? Traditionally, yes, that may encompass killing, soldiers, right? We tell you that more efficiently, war can be achieved. The point of war can be achieved through things like destroying infrastructure, right? And this is why we reduce, second of all, collateral, right? Because humans are not going to be as present, right? We tell you there's not going to be as much human death, and third and finally, we tell you there's no moral ambiguity, or at least there's less moral ambiguity because humans are not making decisions to kill other humans. Rather, we're doing a programmatic thing where we're considering all the factors beforehand preemptively so that we're able to make the drone shoot effectively. We're going to make the autonomous tanks shoot in the places that they should be shooting rather than making bad decisions. And this leads in four impacts. First of all, we result in fewer accidents, right? Because humans always have certain amount of error within them. Second of all, it results in faster wars so that we don't have humans being worn out through war because war is inherently coercive. Third of all, we tell you objectively there's less human damage. And fourth of all, when it comes to war crimes, and this will be my second point, it's going to be much easier to put them on trial, right? So second of all, why we reduce moral ambiguity, but for that, do I have any POIs?
I sent a PO in the chat.
I'll be moving on.
I sent a PO in the chat.
Oh, sure, yeah, go ahead then.
Okay, given that you accept that the point of war is not simply to eradicate the other side, why do you support things like creating essentially killer robots through lethal autonomous weapons whose only goal is to kill things that match the target?
We think there's more to killer robots than your very narrow characterization of what autonomous weapons actually are, right? Because we tell you that all an autonomous weapon does is to maximize the amount of damage in order for that country to come to a compromise, right? We don't think that killing all of its citizens of a country will result in compromise. We think that countries will, give in much earlier than that, right? If you take down major infrastructure, like if major points of infrastructure, that's going to be a much more efficient way of getting a country to like agree to a compromise rather than killing everyone, like all of its citizens or at least all of its like military power, right? We tell you at the end of the day, there's more to like sort of like I've already pointed out. We say that POI sort of like is contingent on the fact that war is only about killing, but we tell you there's more to that, right? You can destroy infrastructure. We don't see why that's important, right? So second one, really quickly, how do we reduce moral ambiguity, right? First of all, we tell you that humans do not make good decisions in most time, especially during war. Why is the case? First of all, we tell you that humans are oftentimes going to be under pressure, right? An army general needs to make a decision of whether or not they should enter a city because like in a really small amount of time, and that army general is going to have a lot of pressure behind them, right? Second of all, we think that humans like often act out of self-protection, and they will often like kill unnecessarily for the sake, if they assess like a risk is going to be really bad on them, right? But third of all, say that humans have a reactionary complex that cannot be like programmed into computers, that cannot be programmed into like AI, right? We tell you that like as a result of this, war crimes are going to be much easier to assess on our side because humans are not the ones making these like questionable moral decisions. Rather, we're going to have these objective decisions where a robot is either going to say yes, I should attack the city, or no, I should not. For all these reasons, right? For the fact that we get better moral conduct, for the fact that we get more efficient war, and for the fact that we get like more efficient political agendas being met, we're very proud to propose.
Here. Thank you very much to the Prime Minister for that fine speech. To begin with the case for the opposition bench, I want to invite the Leader of Opposition to present their speech. Here.
Okay. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. It's astounding how you can say so much and yet say very little. First of all, just in basic definitions, we think that things like cyber warfare and other sort of examples that they throw out to try to confuse you are not part of this debate, right? It's really unclear why they tried to include that in this debate. We think that we're specifically talking about things like, firstly, lethal autonomous weapons, actual killer robots. They tried to hand wave that away by saying like, oh, that's not everything. We agree, it's not everything, but that is something that they must defend because of the fact that the motion is the creation and use of all autonomous weapons. The fact that they think it's okay to hand wave away this simply because of the fact that this is not like all autonomous weapons, we think that that's strategically disadvantageous. But secondly, we think autonomous weapons also extend to systems that will move on their own. That is to say, like nuclear missiles that will automatically fire if they detect an incoming threat, right? We think that these are the kinds of weapons that we're talking about. Now that I've illustrated it, now that I've done government's job and illustrated it for them, what is our stance, right? We think we're fine with, for example, humans controlling machines. We're fine with things like drones. We're fine with things like humans using guns and other like traditional weapons. But we think that we would rather have a total ban on autonomous weapons, both the creation and the use of them, because we think that one will inevitably lead to the other. We think that we can also fairly say the side that will win today's debate is not the side that will like remove moral ambiguity, which they never really impacted, but the side that is best able to preserve the fairness of war and reduce the amount of human cost in the long term. Before I move on to my arguments, just a few rebuttal, right? Firstly, in terms of minimizing human costs, we can bite the bullet and say, sure, right? In small skirmishes, maybe someone will die on our side while it will be robots dying on your side, sure. But in the long term, we think on your side, wars are drastically more likely to be extended and lead to greater human costs in the long term. That is to say that when you use autonomous robots, then that means you are more likely to get more conflicts, you are likely to get longer conflicts. So on our side, we may get, on our side, the conflicts that we will have some human costs. We are willing to accept that, but we would rather have fewer conflicts where this occurs as opposed to a new conflict every other day. Secondly, this idea of removing moral ambiguity, we really don't understand this at all, right? Because of the fact that on your side, surely there's going to be a lot of confusion over whether you can blame a robot following its programming. We think that it's really unclear why they even brought this into the debate, given that it's a purely opposition point, right? Thirdly, they have the gall to mention war crimes, right? War crimes happen outside the battlefield. Things like torturing someone that you have in government custody. Things like making the active decision to develop chemical weapons, which, by the way, can also be integrated into autonomous weaponry. We think at the end of the day, none of the benefits that they've given are actually able to happen. On my first argument about how you create massive danger, right? 4 levels of analysis for this. Firstly, we think accidents will always occur, and in the case of autonomous weapons specifically, they're completely unacceptable. This is because what an autonomous weapon actually looks like is things like an alarm system that will automatically fire back at a country that you've primed it on. And we think that this is unacceptable because weapons cannot tell the difference between a false alarm or the real thing. For example, take 1983 when the Soviet Union's early warning system malfunctioned when they detected US airstrikes when there were none. Because this response was controlled by a human, this human rationalized and decided to wait for corroborating evidence. Therefore, at the end of the day, they decided not to launch nuclear weapons on the US. However, given all of government's logic, if they like said like, oh, in order to minimize your pressure, we will replace it with an automatic system, any sort of accident would have led to an escalation into the first huge nuclear war, right? We think that these are the kinds of situations in which autonomous weapons are completely unacceptable. Government does not have fiat to assume that they are perfect, right? And even if government tries to come up and say that the odds of this happening are a little bit low, the outcome is so devastating, the human cost so unknowable that we cannot stand for this. We think what this demonstrates is that only humans are able to distinguish the specific nuances of each situation. Secondly, lethal autonomous weapons have no sense of right and wrong. They possess no empathy. This means in circumstances where soldiers ought to hold back, you would force these robots to basically fire, right? For example, during World War II, there's a phenomenon among German soldiers where they would hide the presence of Jews, where they would lie to their commanding soldiers about whether they found Jews, like hiding in an attic, right? This is because of basic human emotion, which is crucial when lives are on the line. We think it's absolutely disgusting for them to try to tell you that like such human emotions like sympathy don't belong on the battlefield. Thirdly, we think you place civilians in direct danger, given that the only way for a robot to distinguish between a combatant and a non-combatant is through obvious program clues. This means, for example, in the cases of wars on terrorism, you would encourage the use of civilians as human shields. This already happens in the status quo, but now you make it a massive problem because you make civilians into the target. They are now the sole way to circumvent autonomous weapons. This means, especially in countries that are already controlled by terrorist organizations, you basically turn these civilians into the sacrificial lamb. Fourthly, it's so dangerous because the commanders as well as the media will now feel removed from the action. For example, during the Vietnam War, the largest driving factor behind ending the war was that citizens felt horrified. They felt the war was not worth American lives. What would have happened if these were robots, right? There would be no media pressure because now they're not losing lives. This just happening in, these are just like robots fighting each other in a far off distant land. I think that when there's no media pressure to stop wars, this means that you're more likely to get more campaign for more aggression, and in the long term, you create a war that is blown way out of proportion. You get more human costs on their side. My second point on a massive power disparity, right? We think that because lethal autonomous robots or autonomous weapons are so resource intensive, they require huge amounts of funding. They need the best developmental teams. So we think that oftentimes it's fair for us to say that these are going to be only accessible to the richer countries such as the West, right? We can already see this happening in the status quo. No, thank you, because these forms of technology are being most vigorously pursued by countries like the US, right? It's touted as the answer to the rising powers of China and Russia. We think that the US could easily justify this by giving you political propaganda using the exact same logic that government has just given you, right? We think, therefore, even if you don't accept any of our harms, even if you only say that there are benefits, we think that this is also unacceptable because of the fact that it's so inaccessible to all countries, right? There's a monopoly of these countries that happens in the West, in richer countries. We think you're going to ignite an arms race, for example, to see which country is able to develop the most destructive autonomous weapon first. We think this is going to happen because of things like pride, things of national security, or simply because countries can do it, right? The process in which these countries do this is likely to lead to like developing countries being held at gunpoint. They're going to be held at the behest of developed countries who can station autonomous robots along the border to basically threaten their neighbors into submission, right? Why is this so bad? Why does this only happen on opposition side? We think this only happens on opposition side because of the fact that when you manufacture an autonomous robot, these can be widely produced, right? You can use them for literally any situation. We think that when only one country is willing to take this human cost, when for example, the US is able to send an army of robot soldiers without like a second guess because they think that like, oh, no one's being killed, therefore it's okay. We think this is absolutely unacceptable. Essentially, even if you don't buy any of our harms, you still get a massive monopoly in the world in terms of warfare. We tell you, we've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much to the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. To continue the case for the Gov Bench, let's welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Before I start, I prefer my POIs verbally, please, because I may not be checking the chat during my speech. Two things I'll be bringing you in my speech, right? First thing, we talk to you about how our side of the house actually prevents emotional backlash, which naturally comes from war. But secondly, I'm going to talk to you about how our side of the house also makes war more transparent and the unique benefits and unique impacts of that on our side of the house. But before I do any of that, three problems with the leader of opposition's speech, right? So firstly, they talk to you about how you get longer, more harmful conflict on our side of the house, right? But we think on the point of conflict being longer on our side of the house, we think there's a massive assertion. We don't think that they've explained why this is the case in any way, shape, or form, right? Because of the fact that we think that on our side of the house, we think that conflict is actually shorter, right? So when conflict is actually shorter because of the fact that at least on our side of the house, you get damage done on a larger scale. We don't see how conflict is longer on any side on our side of the house in any way, right? But secondly, they talk about how they talk to you about in status quo, citizens call for wars to end because of lives lost, right? And they give you an example of the Vietnam War, right? We think that in the case of civilians, right? So you can still get this civilian activity on our side of the house, right? Especially when you characterize autonomous weapons as so dangerous and possible and capable of doing so much harm, right? When civilians see their own government ordering these drones, etc., to bomb however many people and to kill innocent civilians, etc., we think these civilians are naturally also going to call for these for them to stop, right? So this also happens on our side of the house, just for a different reason, right? So therefore we don't think that this stands, right? But finally, their final point is about how it disproportionately helps the rich, right? And then they talk to you about a monopoly, etc. Right? Two responses. Firstly, in the status quo, right? If the US or any other Western power got into a war with a smaller country, so the US has the US already in status quo, even without these autonomous weapons, have so much more power than these smaller countries. Right? That looks like things like tanks, looks like significantly larger armies because of just simply having a larger population, right? So therefore, we don't think that this makes much sense. But secondly, there's a reason why these Western powers are involved in almost pretty much every single conflict battle or war which you see in status quo, right? That's why you see the US, Russia, etc., having such an influence in the war in the Middle East, for example, because of the fact that they are able to actually be involved in these wars. I'm probably proving to you that which proves to you that they are actually this monopoly, this disproportionately rich, this problem still exists in status quo. So okay, so first piece of substantive. Why do we prevent emotional backlash of war? The reason why this emotional backlash of this is twofold. Firstly, we think that during wars, soldiers generally get more and more violent and bloodthirsty during the war, right? But why? Because of the fact that when you are in an environment of war for such a prolonged period of time, we think that you naturally naturally become more bloodthirsty and violent, etc. Right? But secondly, they just want that war to end, right? They're going to do whatever they can because they want to go home, they want to see their families, etc. We give you the example of the My Lai massacre, right? We think the reason why in the Vietnam War, right, the reason why this actually happened was because of the fact that people the US soldiers themselves got so fed up, got were just wanted violence, etc. Hated the Vietnamese, right? And we think that this is why you get the mass murder of innocent Vietnamese people, right? But so what are the impacts of it? What are the impacts of this? Firstly, it's just not healthy for the individual, right? On a smaller scale, the individual has gone from a place where they were probably scared of killing people before the war started to a point where they want to kill people, where they welcome killing people. So yes, this may be extreme, but we say it happens in a lot of cases. But secondly, and probably more importantly, it makes the war happen on such a larger scale, right? More people die, more innocent people are harmed, right? We think this is a harm which happens exclusively in the case of when people are fighting. What's the counterfactual? What happens on our side of the house? Why do we solve this problem? The counterfactual is basically that people don't go through that mental toll, right? We think their urge to end the war is significantly less because you're not physically being damaged. You're not being you're going through less of a physical toll. You're going through less of a mental toll. Therefore, this urge to end the war, and because of the fact that you're also not killing people, that mental hazard is obviously significantly less, right? Okay, but secondly, after the war, we think that's okay. So after the war, we think that soldiers are forced to live with events for events off the war for the rest of their lives, right? So what does this look like? This looks like people not being able to sleep in the dark because of fear, right? For example, right? You think that you live with the effects of a war decades after it happens, right? You think it looks like things like harming their lives, this looks like the impact of this that harms like their lives, like while they're with their families, right? You see their children are forced to watch their father struggle through their life for a war which happened 50 years ago, right? We think the impacts of this are pretty obvious. Firstly, it's just not acceptable, right? I think this just should not happen. But the fact that we just don't think it's right. But secondly, we think people can't live a high quality of life even after the war. Then when in the case of autonomous weapons, we think that generally the impact of the war is significantly shorter term, right? Because even if we think because of the fact the impacts are so much shorter term, it makes the war a lot better, right? Okay, what's our counterfactual here? Why do we think we actually solve these problems? We think that we solve these problems because although people are still responsible for destruction and killings, when you order a robot to kill a person, for example, the amount of trauma which you have on our side of the house is significantly less. Why? For two reasons. Firstly, you're not physically there, right? So you don't the environment of a war, right? I think when you don't live in barracks, for example, for years on end, or when you're not in a violent environment surrounded by people who I've already talked about, who want to kill, who have who have these urges to kill people. So we think that therefore the amount of trauma is significantly less. But secondly, on a larger scale, just senses, your senses, right? You don't do these things, you don't hear the gunshots yourself, right? You don't see dead bodies, right? You don't see dying faces, for example, or crying families who you separated, for example, right? Because of this, the amount of pain you actually see your actions have caused, or the amount of pain you've seen happen because of your army, etc. Because that is significantly less. The amount of toll you go through, the amount of mental strain you go through significantly less. Therefore we stop these impacts, these harmful impacts, which I've talked to you about, from happening. So for those reasons, proud to propose. Thank you.
Here. Thank you very much to the DPM for that speech. Next, to continue the case for the opposition bench, let's welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition, here.
Okay, just a reminder that I would like all of my POIs asked verbally, please. Government fails to realize the danger of an autonomous weapon is that it's so unpredictable and unreliable that we have no idea how destructive they can actually be, right? This uncertainty and this risk alone should mean that government's case falls, right? If government is willing to stand by any chance, no matter how small or large, of a failure of to properly detect a threat by an autonomous weapon, that this is extremely unacceptable, right? First piece of rebuttal on how they tell you that you're going to minimize casualties, right? We have this autonomous, as we've already told you, we know autonomous weapons are often extremely unreliable, right? I'm going to be expanding more on this now. We know if they falsely identify these we know the damage that these autonomous weapons can make are catastrophic compared to what one soldier can do, right? Even if they tell you that they even tell you that the damage that is going to be done by these autonomous weapons is going to be so much larger, right? We think that even if the chance of this happening is so small, we think that the harm that they can do is so catastrophic that these autonomous weapons shouldn't be allowed at all, right? We think that they're a lot more destructive, right? Also, you don't get any accountability for these autonomous weapons compared to when you actually have soldiers in the battlefield, right? I mean that everything is going to be so much more murkier on government side because there's no way to actually determine what actually happens, right? I'm going to be expanding more on this later in my point, but basically what we think is that soldiers have, at least they have a sense of morality, right? Which is why we don't understand how the moral ambiguity point even remotely helps government side, but we think they're much more likely to actually think before acting, and therefore it's going to be able to minimize the casualties so much better on opposition side, right? But secondly, they all second piece of rebuttal and how it's going to how the government tells you that it's going to prevent the emotional backlash of war, right? So they tell you that you're these people are going to become a lot more bloodthirsty, a lot more violent because it's going to save them time, right? Specifically, the reason why autonomous weapons are so large scale and they don't have emotions such as like actual soldiers, not at all, mean that they're going to be even more likely to actually pull the trigger and cause more damage, etc. Right? We know that like their DPM literally brings up the amount of pain and trauma that people are going to go through, and that since the weapons don't go through they're much more likely to actually inflict this harm because they don't actually like have any of these emotions, right? And it's going to be much more harder for a person to be able to justify in their heads the massacre of innocent people just because it's faster for them to go home, right? And that this is like we think that you don't get any accountability on government side, right? But third piece of rebuttal, I mean that they've like completely hand waved the argument that we think that the war is going to be extended, right? They asserted that no, this is not going to happen and completely moved on in their DPM speech, right? I mean that what's going to happen is that wars are going to become a lot more common because these governments don't actually consider the loss of autonomous weapons to be a real human cost, right? And that you remove the mechanisms of these governments to actually think twice before actually putting these autonomous weapons into the battlefield, right? And that this means that these wars are going to be a lot more prolonged because there's no longer going to be any media pressure to withdraw or end or to end the war. And that you're going to push. So moving on to my speech about why we think that you're going to get no accountability on government side and why we think this is going to be so much more harmful and cause more casualties within the war, right? We know that like the difference between these soldiers and like autonomous weapons is that the soldiers are actually going to have like empathy, things like morality, right? This is like something that like a government side even agreed with, right? And that in times of war, you need human will, you need human judgment because the lines are blurred, right? The situations are constantly changing and you cannot adhere to a single set of rules that are simply programmed into these autonomous weapons, right? And that's because of the fact that like war is completely unpredictable. We tell you that because since like these circumstances are not always set in place, it's impossible for these robots to be able to make quick decisions and the right judgments because especially like when the stakes are so high, when it's at the cost of like these civilians, right? That they're like it's impossible for them to be able to judge this, right? These robots are like these autonomous weapons are simply designed to attack, where we don't see any like tactical analysis behind their actions. And the robots aren't actually be able to think twice before attacking. I'll take you in a second. We know it's like they have a lot of unchecked power, right? We know like overall, the soldiers are going to be a lot more likely to be cautious with their actions because if it does come down to it, they're going to think about the people who suffer and the people who they care about the most. I'll take your PY.
If you think that governments will no longer have a de-incentive to go into war, generally these robots cost millions and millions of dollars, and therefore if they are damaged, they can do significant like financial harm to the government. Therefore, surely this acts as an incentive, de-incentive.
We think that like so we think that the difference is because like we think that like governments are going to care a lot more about human lives, the casualties of their own citizens, much more than like the cost of like this like of an autonomous weapon, right? And these autonomous weapons don't actually have any like real human cost towards them, and therefore they're much more likely to care about like their actual citizens rather than like a simple like a cost, right? I mean that they're going to be much more like we think this like already in itself is going to be much more likely to cause an incentive for them to be able to prolong the war, right? Okay, so moving back onto like what onto like why we think that soldiers are going to be a lot more cautious, and that they have their own sense of morality. They're more likely to they're more likely to envision, for example, their loved ones or their family and friends being in the place of these civilians that are actually being affected, which is why we think they're going to be able to have a lot more accountability, a lot more of a conscience, right? We think that like it's like a basic common trait for these humans to be able to actually feel empathy and not want to be able to cause significant harm or like inflict it purposely onto like those who are innocent, right? We think the accountability on our side is going to come in two different ways, right? Firstly, through the media, I mean, it's so much more easier for these countries to now distort specific events or cover up like violations of human rights through using autonomous weapons, right? Because of the fact that you no longer have people who are able to account for these events, we tell you that you're going to replace them with robots who aren't able to report back or like give a recount on like what actually happened, right? We think the lack of media coverage in itself that actually like reports on these events is going to like mean that you're not like it happens because like you don't have like sufficient like witnesses or like people who are actually able to like account for like what actually happened, right? And we think that like even like if government tries to come back and tells you like these robots are going to have like cameras or whatever, we know that this footage can be like easily manipulated and distorted by like countries. I mean, it means that it doesn't actually show what is going to happen in these battlefields, right? But second way we're going to be able to have accountability is we think that like why we think that government doesn't achieve accountability is because we think that these soldiers have actual consequences, right? They're able to suffer punishment. They're held accountable accountable by like an international community, the Geneva conventions, etc. And that the same can't be done for autonomous weapons because they don't have emotions, right? They're simply robots, right? I mean that they have like these soldiers have a much greater sense of responsibility because they recognize that if they do end up sacrificing a civilian's life, the burden is on them, and that they recognize this, right? This makes them so much more likely to become a lot more cautious, a lot more careful, and hold themselves accountable when they're in combat, right? And that the impact of this is they're going to be a lot more of the motion is that you're going to have a lot more innocent civilian lives who are suffering as a result of the lack of morality coming from these autonomous weapons, right? But you also remove one of the most essential ways to be able to hold these countries accountable for their actions. For all of those reasons, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Here. Thank you very much to the DLO for that fine speech. Now for the whip speeches, I want to first invite the Gov Whip to present their speech. Here.
Okay, whenever, panel, whenever you're ready. Also, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, and I would prefer verbal POIs. 3, 2, 1, my time starts now. Judge, make no mistakes that the most vulnerable actors in today's debate are the soldiers on the battlefield. They are the soldiers in the battlefield who the war, through military drafts, coercively throws them into, where they have no escape mechanism when they're thrown into some place 8,000 miles away from home, and thus, after the war, are left to salvage the traumas of what this experience has put them through. As such, in avoiding this alternative on our side of the house, in protecting the people on the ground in the best way possible, we think that side government takes this debate decisively, right? So two clashes that we see in today's debate. First of all, on protecting people on the ground. Second of all, on best advancing the agenda of war, namely by ending it as soon as possible, right? First of all, let's talk about protecting people on the ground, right? Because all of opposition assertions or points of rebuttals come under the premise that autonomous weapons look like robots, look like systems that are able to move on their own, and as such that the impacts here look like human shields, look like misprogramming, right? But Judge, understand that autonomous weapons within the status quo are largely made to attack infrastructure, are largely made to advance the political agenda that war is, rather than the senseless killing of people that side opposition seems to think it is, right? This looks like targeting individuals who are actually war criminals here, right? For example, when you look at these drones, when DLO comes here and says that they have cameras, yes, they do have cameras. These drones have cameras, and they're able to track down specific coordinates. We think this greatly minimizes the amount of civilian casualties on our side of the house. Take, for example, a U.S. drone that took out Iranian General Soleimani, right? We think that there's precision in targeting here when these drones are able to actually identify individual people through technological advancements such as facial recognition. We think this is an exclusive benefit on our side of the house when you can minimize casualties. So now to address on their side of the house, when their only defense to this response from Hirsch was by talking about how these programming can be manipulated, right? But Judge, we don't see the government incentive to actually manipulate their own programming, right? Judge, understand how ridiculous this actually sounds. We think that the state obviously has an agenda to push their social political interests through war, not to senselessly kill the number of people on the ground. And we don't think this is militarily strategic when they're sabotaging their own programs or some sort, as they want to talk about here, right? So second of all, their defense here is talking about how accidents occur, how thus this can escalate the amount of harms and weapons on the ground, right? Two responses here. First of all, as I've talked to you about the precision of autonomous weapons in the first place, and the technological advancements that these weapons bring in the first place, we think first of all that these accidents are simply less likely to happen and are supported by moral ambiguity, which exacerbates their harms. And I'll talk more about this later. But Judge, understand the second premise here, that even if they are catastrophic, and I really hope this doesn't criminalize me, but it is more likely that the war will end immediately, right? If it is as catastrophic as they say as they are. We think this is marginally better in the long term on our side of the house, when you don't have countries continuing to pour troops on the ground, continuing to let these people lead these people towards their death and their deathbeds here, right? We think this is substantially more harmful in the long term when you have more people in the war in the first place, right? Thus, we don't see how they protect people on the ground here. So as such, what do we uniquely give to you in terms of protecting soldiers, right? We think it saves soldiers from emotional backlash in the long term. We think war in the principle is coercive. We think the army drafts forces. When the army actually drafts soldiers on the ground, it looks like they're taking any adult above any able-bodied man above the age of 18 to to enlist as long as they meet the physical requirements here, right? Understand that this is morally constricted here on their side of the house. Understand the entire point of army enlistment is bad when these individuals don't have the agency to choose whether or not they want to put themselves in decades of bloodshed and familial disconnection, that they're reintegrated after the war in a society that has left them behind with a lack of education and with a moving workforce, right? Hitting on the comparative, when you have less people dispatched in the first place, that you don't exacerbate these long-term harms. Second of all, understand that there are also people that have committed egregious actions under state command, right? Understand that there are people who are forced to torture to extract classified information, that they're killing somebody under the premise of self-defense. Understand that these are psychological harms that actually trickle down to these people having to confront the severity of the mistakes that they make after the war. This looks like PTSD. This looks like more psychological harms on an individual basis that we uniquely avoid on our side of the house. Because, Judge, the exclusive thing here is that the exclusive benefit on our side of the house is that we are able to actually protect these most vulnerable actors. Because sure, even while behind autonomous weapons, that you have these state officers who program these machines in the first place, understand that is entirely voluntary from them, right? Understand that is also how you get accountability, which we think answers the question from what opposition said just now, right? But understand that as such, we protect the most vulnerable actors who are involuntarily dropped into these circumstances in which they have no escape, in which they are shackled to the premises of these battlefields and are either killed or come back to their homes without even being able to recognize themselves in the first place. Thus, we think we better protect people on the ground under these premises, right? So second clash here, when we're talking about advancing the agenda of the war by ending it as soon as possible. What does opposition give you? They talk to you about extending wartime through these accidents. We've already told you how these accidents are far less likely to happen on our side of the house. And why is this? Because of moral ambiguity. Because while they say that it is likely that people can enact morally right or justifiable actions by saving more people on the ground, we tell you it is just as likely that people are engineered to exacerbate the harms to others, right? We tell you that humans on the principle level are driven by emotion and self-protection. This looks like, for example, incidents such as an army general making decisions to attack innocent civilians on the basis of protecting himself against an innocent man who may draw out a gun under the impression that he will be killed, right? This looks like inflicting more pain than necessary to extract classified information because these soldiers are so gung-ho to attack the enemy as they have been trained within the war barracks. And yes, Edgar, I'll take your POI.
Okay, let's look at a scenario in which a general might be placed under pressure. For example, they see like a missile approaching. In those cases, right, at the very least, the general could make the decision not to launch. Under your side, an autonomous system would launch no matter whether it contributed to like a greater attack or not. What's your response to this?
We think this extent of moral ambiguity is present on both sides of the house, as you've evidenced, as you've thrown out just now through that example, and as I've showed to you here on an individual basis of the general murdering innocent civilians. We don't think this actually holds any substantial place in today's debate. And furthermore, when we tell you that it's on the basis of killing individuals, as gruesome as it is in the status quo, we think that this leads to more diplomatic tensions driven by acts of these moral ambiguity, right? We think this looks like killing of Islamic civilians, leading to more retaliation against the US, extending the time of the warfare by tenfold, right? Thus, we think that we take this comparative that on their side of the house, they're more likely to extend wartime in the first place. Lastly, their response here is to talk about their other contention here is to talk about power disparity. Thus, we don't think this is mutually exclusive. We look like countries such as China and the US are still hegemonic under the status quo and give human-driven weaponry, right? They still have a resource disparity within them in the developing world. Thus, we don't see how this also stands in today's debate. As such, Judge, simply because we think we take both clashes here on A, protecting people on the ground. Second of all, actually advancing the agenda of war in the first place through more precise action targeting, we take today's debate. Thank you.
Here. Thank you very much, Liga, for that speech. And to conclude all substantive speeches in this round as a whole, I want to invite the opposition with here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, I would also prefer my POIs to be verbal, please. Government has framed their case such that their entire case is contingent on the fact that they somehow get less human cost and less casualties. So if I prove that isn't true, they just simply automatically lose, right? We think that the analysis that they gave on why there's going to be less casualties have been extremely surface level. We don't think that they've sufficiently given enough rebuttal to all our analysis as to why in the long term, the human costs are far greater and you do not create a more peaceful world, right? Just look at their language, right? How can government whip come up here and tell you that soldiers are the most vulnerable when they're the ones holding the guns, right? Where it's the civilians in developing countries being brutally murdered by these killing machines that don't have any control, that barely have any form of accountability, right? We're not denying PTSD or the trauma of these soldiers, right? But when their LO from the very beginning tells you that reducing human costs is the main goal, we don't think that they achieve it at all, right? Let's look at what they told you. Essentially, they told you about like efficiency, about how you can like you're not going to kill humans, and therefore there's less human damage. You're not going to deploy soldiers, right? Like we just don't think that their analysis on human cost is true, right? On several levels. First of all, we think that you're going to end up killing more people on the ground because these weapons are so much more destructive, right? We told you this from our very beginning, right? You are delegating life and death decisions to machines on a battlefield, right? We told you from the very beginning that autonomous weapons don't just extend to these robots on the ground, right? It extends to entire systems that revolve around things like chemical warfare, right? Things like autonomous nuclear warning signals that are primed to just fire back no matter what, right? Like we tell you that like oftentimes the civilians that you are going to kill and the nature of war and the type of war that you are going to ensue is far worse on your side. Secondly, we also told you that accidents are bound to occur, right? And they are completely unacceptable in the case of these autonomous weapons because oftentimes the weapons can't tell between like a false alarm or the real thing, right? I tell you that these things are far more likely to happen without human judgment there, right? We also told you it was easier to manipulate, right? Because it's programmed by simply having algorithms, right? These effects are further compounded when you look at the lack of accountability that is on side government. And I'm also going to be expanding on this more later in my second class, right? But let's look at a macro level, right? We tell you that there's just going to be more violence globally. Why is this the case? We told you because in terms of an arms race, right? We told you that these warfare capabilities are going to proliferate because you make the wars that do happen so much more dangerous and so much more destructive, right? Because when one country begins to start developing these lethal autonomous weapons, other major global powers are going to want to keep up, right? Therefore, it turns into a race to see who can make the most destructive and the most disgusting war weapon there is, right? Because of matter of pride, of matter of national security, right? None of these global powers want to be left behind, right? Also, secondly, right, a bigger point, no thank you, we told you that there's going to be much more aggression because people feel more removed, right? Like what like side government tried to tell you about this is that like, oh, people are going to see the drones that are being bought by the government, right? This is ridiculous analysis coming from side government, right? Seeing machines being deployed into war is drastically different than seeing your father or your brother go into war, right? You cannot weigh up the two because the difference between having your friends and like having humans go to war, right? They're so different, right? Humans are emotional beings and they connect with other humans because of their shared humanity, right? You cannot compare that with like sending drones out to a war, right? We tell you that aggression is far more likely to happen because engaging in armed conflicts is very costly in several ways, right? For example, there are like financial costs, right? That conflicts incur. There are like political, social, moral costs, right? We tell you that like when political decision makers as well as the public are like usually very hesitant when it comes to engaging in like armed conflict with like these soldiers, right? Because we tell you that like the cost benefit analysis of like having humans in the conflict might change with the introduction of these autonomous weapons, right? We told you that like oftentimes these countries like that have these weapons are often going to be rich or they're going to spend a lot of their budget on military spending, right? Like the US, right? So we tell you that the difference between having these autonomous weapons, we tell you that's far more likely for them to actually spend more money on deploying these weapons. People are going to feel far more emotionally detached when it's simply having these machines going out. We tell you that wars are going to happen more frequently and the nature of these wars are going to be far more destructive on your side, right? And on like therefore in terms of utilitarianism scale, which is the metric that government wants to use, they already lose, right? Because in the long term, wars are far more likely to occur. You're going to have more civilians killed, you're going to have more bombs dropped on cities. We tell you that like the level of war and the types of wars are just going to proliferate because the capacities of warfare are also going to increase, right? When you have these countries in an arms race competing for who can make the most dangerous weapon, right? All of this is far more likely to happen because of the lack of accountability, right? Which is the second clash in today's debate, right? We told you, and this is all of the clash about like moral ambiguity, right? We told you that when you have humans on the ground, when you have soldiers, they have like, especially in times of war, when situations are often quite complex, you cannot fit, like there is not a single set of rules and regulations and a mold that you can fit and apply to every single war because every type of situation in a war is very complex and very different, right? Therefore, we think that human judgment is exclusive and sometimes is necessary in order to prevent the worst things from happening, right? You cannot just put a machine on the battlefield and like program it so that it does the right thing because there is no such thing as the right thing, right? Because situations are often changing, right? We also told you especially in terms of weapons, right? When you have these autonomous drones, there is no chain of command, right? What makes autonomous weapons autonomous is precisely the fact that they make decisions autonomously, right? Without prior command to do so, right? Therefore, like when you give them a set of like behavior rules or like algorithms to make oftentimes these decisions are made outside like a military chain of command, right? Oftentimes, like with soldiers and like with having humans on the ground, you have a chain of command, right? There is a clear hierarchy. The decision-making process is explicit and is top down, right? It makes it so much easier to actually trace the thought process of the decision-making, right? Therefore, it makes it so much easier to actually get accountability in terms of the hierarchy in the case of a like international humanitarian law violation, right? As opposed to like autonomous weapons where you don't have this chain of command at all, right? We also told you in terms of media and publicity, right? It's far easier to cover up. You don't have anyone on the ground. Because like oftentimes these countries are far more incentivized. If it's simply having robots, right? They're far more incentivized to cover up. They can easily manipulate these footage on the cameras, right? And lastly, in terms of principle, like just should we do this, right? We told you like from the very beginning that the danger of these weapons, the extent of destruction that these weapons can do, it's just unacceptable for anybody to use as a whole, right? We told you like in times of war, we want to preserve human dignity, right? It's why we have things like the Geneva Convention, things like the IHL, right? Oftentimes these principles require like humane treatment of others, right? We tell you that as machines, right? These machines, the amount of destruction they do just do not like fall within preserving human dignity. They do not fall within actually preserving human life as best as possible, right? We told you, especially with things like the power disparity, right? You exacerbate this with lethal weapons that could revolutionize the destructive nature of war, right? And because of all these reasons, so proud to oppose today. Thank you.
Here. Thank you very much to the Opp Win for that fine speech. And now to sum up the cases for both sides of the House with the speaking orders reversed, let's first welcome the opposition reply. Here.
The time starts in 3, 2, 1. In a debate about war, where the first thing agreed on by both sides is that these are very expensive, therefore they're probably only going to be accessible by like certain countries. Government's case is that we make soldiers feel more comfortable with the consequences of their actions. Just let the insanity of that sink in, right? In a world where your autonomous weapons are massacring, brutalizing citizens in developing countries because they fit the criteria, in a world where those civilians were being used as meat shields, government prides themselves on the fact that on the fact that commanders and soldiers did not have to deal with the consequences of those actions. We think that the very fact that they've chosen to take this stance today is exactly the nail in the coffin, right? Because of the fact that they've been unable to deny the fact that these weapons are exclusive to certain countries, the fact that these weapons are abused by certain countries. Therefore, the consequences of that are what this debate is about. The debate is not about which side can better help soldiers escape like mental trauma, right? We think that it's disgusting that government even tried to tell you that the most vulnerable actors are not the terrorists, are not the terrorized civilians from a war-torn country because they're too poor to manufacture their own weapons and fight back, right? LO even conceded in the very first minute of the debate that wars are fought for a multitude of selfish reasons, like resources, like land, or just political agendas. So they conceded that like they don't need a reason to fight, right? Any developed country could literally send in these robots, like never need to fight back and never even need to consider the human cost because now you have put the robot in their hand, right? What did we tell you throughout this debate? We told you in first, these autonomous weapons are massively more dangerous because of 4 reasons. Firstly, you can't recognize accidents or malfunctions. They possess no sense of empathy. They don't hold back. Thirdly, they encourage battles to occur in civilian areas because that's how you can avoid being a target. And fourthly, they're able to distance themselves from the consequences of their airstrike. Secondly, we told you that there's a power disparity that's ultimately the nail in government's coffin. In our second speaker, we also told you that there's no accountability, which is also analysis that proves why wars are likely to be more extended, why wars are likely to happen far more often. Given all of this, we think that the debate boils down to 3 questions. Firstly, which side will reduce overall human cost? Government's mechanism is so simple. It's because you only have robots on the battlefield, therefore no one will really die. Note that this is contingent on a super specific scenario in which it's two countries that are both wealthy enough to manufacture these weapons. It doesn't cause any further hostility that lingers after the skirmish. The battle happens far removed from populated areas. Like we told you, we think that this sort of scenario is so unlikely to occur, right? And the vast majority of cases are not between countries with an equal amount of funding, countries that mutually like shake hands after the war and be like, that was fun, right? We think that at the end of the day, what's going to happen is that you're going to have developing countries brutalized and terrorized by developed countries. We think when government focuses their entire case as if it's a question of who can make soldiers feel the most comfortable, we've revealed to you that the trade-off is actual civilian lives. Note that they never actually engaged with this analysis. They simply dismissed it and moved on. We told you that wars are far more likely to occur, they're likely to be extended, and these robots cannot be held accountable. Secondly, which side actually does gain more accountability? We told you, we told you, and we doubled down in our wit speaker that a human can be put on trial, a human can be judged, a human can be sentenced, right? But after a devastating massacre done by robots, who do you hold accountable? Government was never able to justify this, was never able to illustrate this, because they spent all of their time talking about how they're able to save soldiers from feeling bad that they brutalized a civilian, right? We think that purely because of this, we should win. But thirdly, which stakeholders should we prioritize? Government tells you that it's the soldiers who, by the way, chose their careers. So soldiers who like swore to serve and protect. We tell you that the actual stakeholder that we ought to protect are the civilians who have no choice, who have no way of fighting back. These are the civilians in foreign countries, right? We think it's borderline discriminatory for government to frame it as the mental safety of our soldiers is more important than the lives of foreign civilians, right? We think that when you consider the debate like this, there's nothing that government could possibly say in their reply to come back from this. We take this debate by a landslide. Thank you.
You're here. Thank you very much to the opposition reply. And to conclude this grand final as a whole, I want to welcome the Gov reply. Here.
There are two main issues which I see in today's debate. Firstly, on who makes war better on a macro level, on a wider perspective, but secondly, who actually helps individual soldiers, right? But so we think that side government takes both of these sorts of issues, right? So firstly, regarding war on a macro level, so there are three main sort of like points of discussion, right? Firstly, on the length and the amount of war which actually happens. Secondly, on the actual accountability of the war, and thirdly, on thirdly like on this weird point about rich like disproportions and like how it disproportionately helps the rich, right? So firstly, on the point of length and amount of war, why do side government actually take this class, right? So firstly, they talk to you about incentives, right? The government on our side of the house has less of a de-incentive to go into war because you don't actually lose soldiers' lives. But we think that on our side of the house, when you lose millions and millions of dollars of robots, etc., robots which have probably been developed which have taken like decades and decades to actually develop, this de-incentive is still extremely large on our side of the house. But secondly, they've sort of asserted that governments always care more about like a few soldiers being killed than like millions and millions of dollars being destroyed, right? So many developed and greedy leaders will often rather have a few people die than millions of dollars gone to waste, right? But so secondly, they talk to you about the accountability. Secondly, they talk about the accountability of the war, right? But look, we've already addressed this in our substantive. We tell you that because of the fact that people in status quo, when their job is to defend status quo, and they talk to you about how war, and they talk to us about accountability of war, they already lose today's debate because the fact that war and status quo has pretty much no accountability. And there are cases of torture, cases of rape, cases of war crimes which happen on a smaller scale, which never accounted for because of the fact that each human does it on an individual scale, right? So on our side of the house, we say if these things are to happen, that they're going to be programmed for it to happen. Therefore, it's a lot easier to tell whether or not it happened because of the fact that there's proof of it, right? Things like when you look at things like programs, for example, right? Okay, but finally on the point rich disproportions, they brought this up in the first speaker and then didn't address it again until pretty much the end of their third. Look, we think that this is pretty much a wash in today's debate because the fact that in the case of rich disproportions, I feel like you can't get much more for rich disproportion in terms of war and battle than there is like right now, right? In status quo. Because the fact that like countries like the US, countries like Russia, countries like these richer Western countries, right? They already have such a wars, or they're already like disproportionately favored when there is a war, because the fact they've just got more money. There's nothing you can do to fix that, right? Therefore, we don't see how this is any better on their side of the house, right? They failed to actually address that, right? But secondly, on the case of who actually helps individuals, so individuals, right, on in a micro scale, right? Side opposition claim that this doesn't matter in the case of war. We think that being people's lives being lost and people being killed is actually like a pretty big part of war, right? It's the main reason why you don't want people the main reason why you don't want war to happen in the first place, right? So firstly, on the point of and so firstly, we think on our side of the house, we decrease the amount of lives lost. We think we think innocent civilians, for example. They talk about innocent civilians are probably more important, right? So even if this were true, we think that innocent civilians are very unlikely to happen, right? Because the fact, like, when you go back to what they tell you about how, like, you know, when you go back to what they tell you about how like citizens are going to call for the war to end, right? When you destroy the homes and when you end lives with these with these autonomous weapons, we think like this war is like these citizens are still going to call for the war to end because they don't want their country doing inhumane things with these weapons. So for those reasons, project proposed. Thank you.
Here. Thank you very much to the reply, and that concludes the grand finals for CLPID 2021. I invite all speakers to virtually cross-point shake hands on an excellent debate. The judges will now move to a breakout room to discuss.